She fell to her knees in the drift and offered the only thing she had left to give. Snow licked up the hem of her skirts, cold cutting through wet wool to skin. Her fingers could not feel the leather strap of the bundle she held. They only knew the weight of the small, warm thing that cried a single, thin sound and then went still against her breast. The road behind her was a white smear, a swallowed track of prints leading from a house that had once been a home. The road ahead ended at a low porch light, one square of warmth in an ocean of white. And at that light, a man stood where his hand rested on the latch and watched. Clara Winslow did not plead with the man. She did not have words arranged for what she had become. She had a name only for the child, Netty. She had a name for herself only in the most practical of terms, a farmer, a keeper of cattle and corn, and contract labor. Tonight she was nothing but a mother whose hands were too numb to hold posture or pride. She extended Netty, the little face streaked with soot, and the breath that fogged between them was a prayer without syntax. "Take her," she said, the sound more snow than voice. "Take her, just—" The man at the door was not a stranger to hardship. Hardship had carved him in the same weathered way it had carved her. Silas Brennan owned his land in a way that meant he could not help the sight of another human left raw to the weather. For a long time, he simply looked at the child. Then he opened the door. They let the wind come in with them. Inside, the house smelled of boiled bones and soap and a faint sweet of molasses. There were blankets piled on a settle by the stove, a child's wooden toy on the floor, a man's coat thrown over a peg that had once held a better coat. Silas, more bark than talk, set down his lantern and did what the old houses expected. He made 2 beds of hay and wool and mercilessly beat a ring of crusted frost from Clara's shawl. He set a pan of goat's milk on to warm and went to fetch blankets stiff with powdered flour from a sack. Clara had left the farm with her hands full of small terrors. The slam of a door in the dark, a voice that made the floor roll, a fistful of oats, and an oath to be gone by dawn. She had run because she had to. She had fled because staying meant a terrible arithmetic, her time versus the child's life. She had not meant to end at Silas's door. She had not expected to find anything but another closed shutter, another locked hearth. 3 doors along the road had been shut before the porch light had shown its patience. The first had been a farmer she knew for the barley he sold to her. He had looked at Netty, then at Clara's face, and tightened his jaw until his mouth was a line. The second door belonged to Mrs. Cole down at the smithy. Sympathy was a luxury no one could afford, she had said, and then she had pulled the bolt and left the storm outside. The third had been a church parson who had told them to seek refuge with kin. She did not let herself go back to the violence in detail. She had learned that detail was a temptation someone might pull at to discredit the whole. The times she let her memory run were measured like a tide, enough to know what to fear, not so much as to drown in it. The valley talked in small towns. News moved like the weather. First a whisper among the women at the well, then a clank of tongues in the corner of the store. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore was a person by whom gossip found weight. She was a widow who had lived long enough to keep ledgers for everyone and had the habit of keeping them current. Agnes had an eye for ledger entries that were neither numbers nor wool, but habits. Who came by the mill with the same coat, how the children were dressed, whether there was a new horse hitch. She saw Clara's absence as a ledger gap and did what widows do. She filled it with notes. It was Agnes who first named the stranger who would complicate the sheltering. "Virgil Harkins is back in town," she told Silas one afternoon, standing with a knee in the dirt where she tied a chicken's foot to a string to keep it from straying. Agnes's voice was not loud. It did not have to be. The valley tunes itself so that loudness is unnecessary. The few who have something to say speak little. "He's here with money and an acquaintance at the law office. Says he's looking for his wife and the child." Silas's face did not change at the news. He was a man who measured danger in fences and weight. He knew the shape of a threat by the way it pushed. "He has the means," he said. "Rich men always find a way." Agnes's ledger entries were small mercies. She also carried a different curiosity. "You shouldn't be hiding her," she said, half to herself, half to the house. "If she stays hidden, he'll say she ran." The way the town chose its allegiances would be a slow reveal. Words travel on rails, and the rails in Cedar Falls were old with precedent. A successful man who kept money and gave to the church earned a margin of credence that could outbalance the ragged jacket of a fleeing woman. Virgil, where he went, took the room's breath. He was the kind of man who opened doors by turning his hands toward the future, hands that had signed contracts and had closed sales and had cut a figure that the town admired. He could smile, and the smile made the cracks that his behavior made less visible. He did not have to be there to cast a shadow. In the following days, small things altered. A neighbor she had thought would stand silent as rocks started to avoid eye contact. Men at the feed store sent glances that were more wary than resolute. Someone tucked a paper into the township bulletin, a notice that Virgil Harkins had filed a petition for custody. No details, just a name on a legal docket. The courthouse had a way of taking a rumor and shaping it into an instrument. Clara watched shreds of normality peel at the edges. The farmhouse became a place of counsel as much as shelter. Agnes came by often, bringing a jar of pickled pears and a stack of folded papers that looked more like a beginning than an end. She had a cigarette paper patience and a memory for small things that made her dangerous in the best way. She remembered exactly what date a man had borrowed a tool, what time a neighbor passed by with a marked horse, what a child's voice sounded like on the day before they learned to speak. "Tell me the dates," Agnes said one morning, with Netty asleep in a cradle by the window. "Every time, Clara. Every scrap we can tie to his temper, to the leaving." Clara set the kettle and made a list in the soft place where history sometimes hides. Dates, moments, small injuries that had witnesses. She had been careful in the old life because she knew the ways men like Virgil worked, erasing the pieces that made a woman credible. She kept what she could on slips of paper folded into a Bible. She had saved a letter once, crumpled and yellowed, that spoke in the careful hand of someone who offered apologies as a man offers alms. Agnes took the notes and folded them into a bundle, her face knitting into a ledger entry of its own. "You're not thinking of running again?" Agnes asked, and the question was meant to be an anchor. "I'm not going to run," Clara said. Saying it made something inside her settle. It was half vow and half announcing an intention. There was a tenacity in her voice that surprised even herself. The furnace of hardship had forged something steadier than fear. He won't take her. There was an early plan that was all muscle memory and stubbornness. If the law could be marshaled to her side, then she could stop being chased across county lines. In their rough way, the farmhouse crew formed a council. Silas did not pretend to be anything but a land-tethered man, but he had a weapon that counted for more than muscle, credibility. When he said something in a town like Cedar Falls, there was a weight to it. Emmett listened and learned to carry messages on his small horse between fences. Agnes took to the courthouse with the speed of someone who remembered where the threads lay. They would gather witnesses, they would trace the ledger entries, and see if a judge could be persuaded. The trouble with the law was that it had doors of its own. It could be a refuge or a trap, and a man like Virgil knew how to set his foot in both. He did not need to be crude to be cruel. He filed papers with a careful hand. He had affidavits assembled that read like small sermons. He had a lawyer who spoke in exactly the right cadence for a magistrate, inclined to believe what prosperity had to say. And he made the mistake all men like him made. He assumed that language could twist the shape of a fact into anything he pleased. When he first came to the farmhouse, he arrived not with a swagger, but with a measured step. He was dressed as though meant to give a sermon on his own behalf, coat brushed, boots clean, a hat in his hands like a pledge, and he offered a courtesy that felt like a glove. He did not raise his voice. He moved through the room with the ease of a man who had never learned the harshness of fields. "Clara," he said. His name had the soft weight of someone who expected a response. Netty slept under a crocheted shawl. Clara had not let the child play while he was near. She kept her hands between them in a way that made boundary. "You don't have to do this." What she heard, between his words, was the quiet coercion of habit. His charm was a thing she recognized from years in the same house. A way of making one believe that the man was the center of things, that his dissatisfaction had the moral weight to remake the world. "You are here," he said, turning towards Silas. "This is not my business to trouble a neighbor, but I have come for my family." Silas looked at him as he looked at a windstorm, capable of bending branches but not of changing soil. "We don't hand over children because a man signs a paper," Silas said, and there was the ring of an old law. Hands on land, hands that would not be told by a man from town what to do. Virgil smiled, the kind of smile that is the exact opposite of contamination. "I prefer to solve things without spectacle," he said. "You have a good house, Mr. Brennan. A man of my standing would be grateful for a simpy return." The valley watched. In a town where gossip is currency, the sight of a man in fine clothes taking the porch was a broadcast. The few who still walked past the Brennan steps did so with caution. Men in the feed store talked in low voices about what a city-trained lawyer might say. There were whispers tucked into the clinks of cups at the general store. Perhaps she had left of her own accord, some said. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding. Those who had not been given the interior details of Clara's life were comfortable telling tales in which the power of a man's word outweighed a woman's pleading. On the afternoon Virgil left the farm, he did so with a slow considerateness that made the barn creak. He had left a small paper on Silas's table, an official-looking letter that smelled faintly of new ink, and the assumption that language could replace the facts that had been lived. It was a petition. It asked for the return of his child and berated the idea of harboring a woman who was transient and unstable. It spoke in terms of rights and property, and, by implication, the dangers of keeping a child from her proper guardian. Clara read it twice, and then folded it into a corner of her apron. A feeler of law had taken root in the house like a frost nibbling at the heels of spring. That night she walked the yard until the moon had grown thin. The cedar wind moved the fence posts in a way that had always calmed her. Danger felt more abstract when it had a sonic profile. She thought of how many times, in the course of a life spent coaxing turnips into being, she had been expected to give up. The land had taught her the thing men in parlors did not know. The only certainties are the work and the refusal to be broken by weather. "I'll stand," she told the land, as if land could bear witness. "If he brings the law, then I will meet it in the light. I won't let him take her away." Emmett and Silas and Agnes and a handful of town women met in whisper to plan. Agnes had already been to the county seat and had found an ally in a judge who remembered her late husband's debts of kindness. He would not promise to move heaven for them, but he would hear them. The sheriff, Baker, was a man who knew the difference between law and favor. He had been polite to Virgil in town because a man's comfortable place often commands civility. But Baker was not a man who could be bought with smiles. He had come by the farmhouse and done the rough politeness of a constable, measured, inquisitive, and careful to mark what had occurred. He had advised caution, he had not taken sides. And his neutrality, in a place like Cedar Falls, was as close as one got to an ally. There is a point in any life of flight where a person chooses what to be when the road ends. Clara had been running for months. The rustle of her skirts had been a constant oath to leave. Yet now, with Netty warm against her skin, and the faces of people who had believed her in ways that would not look good in a ledger, she felt something inside change. Running had not saved her before. Running had only shifted the fight. She had to do something she had never done before, stand in front of the town and tell it what had happened. "Then let's put it on paper," Agnes said, Names, dates, who saw what. If they want a petition, we'll give them testimony. Clara sat at the table beside the stove and dipped her fingers in ink as though it were a map of blood. The list Agnes compiled was more than a catalogue of wrongs. It was a hard-minded account that would survive the polishing of a man's lawyer. She wrote the night he had come with flowers and promises. She wrote the winter he smashed a door in a fury. She wrote the time he had come home smelling of other women's perfume and said with a smile that she was imagining things. She wrote small notations about who had seen what, who had heard when the yelling started, who had tended her when the blood in her mouth tasted like pauper. Agnes folded her notes into a neat packet and tucked them into the lining of a coat. They prepared themselves for the first step, a petition for an injunction that would prevent Virgil from removing Netty from the county while a hearing was scheduled. In a frontier county, the law could be blunt and slow. An injunction was a petition to the court to freeze the status quo, to buy time, and to keep a child from being moved before a court had heard the facts. They prepared themselves for the first step, a petition for an injunction that would prevent Virgil from removing Netty from the county while a hearing was scheduled. In a frontier county, the law could be blunt and slow. An injunction was a petition to the court to freeze the status quo, to buy time, and to keep a child from being moved before a court had heard the facts. It was not full vindication. It was a pause, a breathing space, in which the truth could be gathered and scattered. The next morning a rider came from town with a writ in hand. Not Virgil's writ, but a notice that a legal matter might be at hand. The rider was a small man who had the look of a person who had read too many affidavits. He coughed and then delivered the paper as if it were a bouquet. He would leave the piece of paper that made the danger public, a writ filed at the county seat that would likely be served by the sheriff. Once a writ is served, the whole machinery of law begins to grind, and anyone who had to do with the matter risked being pulled into its spokes. Clara read the document and, for a moment, felt something like vertigo. The words were formal and dense. They were like a wall of neat stones. They said that Virgil Harkins had petitioned for the restoration of parental rights and would seek a hearing. They spoke of dates and best interests and the presumption of a father's right. But beneath the ink was a different kind of fact. Men of influence could shape narratives by the time they filed them. "Do we have witnesses?" Sheriff Baker asked, sitting with his back to the stove and watching the fire move a pattern across the room. His voice had the dry wear of someone who had been around when houses burned for other reasons. "If this goes to court, it's not just our words. We need more." "Agnes has names," Silas said. "She brought them last night." "And the letter," Clara said. "There's a letter." She spoke with a measure that surprised her. It was one thing to be sown by shelter. It was another to move from being the thing sheltered to being the lodestone that drew other people toward action. She knew how fragile courage could be, how quickly it could dissolve into expedience. The fact that she chose to stay when she had left before felt like an act of reason as much as one of feeling. It was the only way to ensure Netty's safety. "You're asking a lot," Sheriff Baker said. He was not dismissive. His look held the gravity of someone who had to make a choice. "You're asking people to stand in a courtroom against a man people think well of. That will cost them something." "Then we'll pay it," Silas said. "We pay it with whatever we've got." A hush fell. Netty stirred in her sleep and made a small sound like a bell. The farmhouse, which had absorbed so many of the battles of the valley, held it all in a kind of silence that could also be called attention. There is a way in which standing is contagious. Someone had to be the first to stop running. Clara's decision made the choice for others, or at least clearer. Agnes went to the county seat with the neat packet of memoranda. Silas wrote his statement as a man who could testify to the kind of man Virgil was when he thought no one watched. Emmett was dispatched with a note to a cousin in town who would make a stitch in the social net. Sheriff Baker set in motion the ordinary machinery, notice to the county clerk, a request to set a hearing date, the small bureaucratic things that in a town like Cedar Falls are the bones of justice. When word got out that an injunction was being sought, the town's reaction splintered. Some women came quietly to the farmhouse, offering blankets and the small common currency of baked goods. Men of trade and stable commerce steered their wagons a degree away from Silas's gate, as if proximity might stain their accounts. Virgil did not hide his displeasure. He moved through the town with the deliberate charm of a man who expects the world to bend. He spoke to the general storekeeper in a manner that made the storekeeper tilt toward him the way a scale tips. "It's a shame," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "So much confusion. People get hurt when rash choices are made." "Rash choices?" Agnes said quietly to Clara when she came back from the county seat. "He'll try to sell the idea that you're a runaway, that you left of your own will." "I didn't leave," Clara said. "I got out." The phrasing mattered. In the law, as in the field, language is a tool. A runaway is a creature of a legal imagination, someone who leaves a paternal roof of their own free will. A woman who fled to save her child was something else entirely. They would have to make that distinction together. The first blow came on a small Tuesday morning. A deputy with the sheriff's office, an older man with a loud voice and a habit of clearing his throat, arrived with a legal document that on its face looked neutral. It was a notice that Virgil Harkins had filed for temporary custody, and that a hearing would be scheduled in the county seat within a week. The sheriff placed the paper on the table like a shard. Clara's first thought was not of law, but of weather. Time, she realized, was a kind of frost. It could crystallize and trap things if left unattended. The hearing would be the place where the town watched her like a spectator at a match. They would measure her in the flash of one afternoon. She found herself thinking of Emmett's face, the way the boy had held Netty's mitten that first night, like proof that tenderness could be taught. "People will come," the deputy said. "If there's a hearing, the court will call witnesses." Clara thought of the list Agnes had compiled, names of women who had seen bruises when a supposed argument ended, a neighbor who had heard doors crash in the night, a midwife who had once given aid. She saw those names in a row, as if she could line them up like fence posts and build a boundary to keep out the storm. She also remembered, with the particular clarity of a wound, how the world sometimes punishes the truth-teller. Virgil would not be crude. He would be precise. He would have affidavits from those who owed him favors and from those who preferred the comfort of a man of means over the messy reality of a woman's story. The law makes no promises of fairness. It only gives a place to make a case. "Then we make our case," Clara said. The voice came steady. It was a practical plan wrapped in stubbornness and a small, fierce tenderness. "We gather the papers. We bring the witnesses. We don't let him take her when he assumes because of the cloth on his back." That afternoon she sat by the stove and mended a small tear in Netty's blanket. The stitches were deliberate, small, and unshowy. The house hummed with the mechanics of preparation. Agnes typing or writing longhand by lamplight, Silas checking harnesses, Emmett practicing a child's part as though he could file it in his memory for the day when the courthouse would call his name. There was a sense of a people binding themselves together in the absence of any certainty. When the hour came to ride to the county seat to meet with the judge who might grant an injunction, Clara dressed in a coat that had been patched a dozen times. She did not overdo her appearance. There is a kind of dressing up that looks like a plea, and she needed neither plea nor performance. She needed a body that could hold a child and speak with the particular steadiness that made a judge grant a pause. Agnes handed her a folded packet, witness names in neat formation, a letter, a crumpled thing, that could serve of direct evidence, and a list of things to say should the court press for specifics. "Whatever you do," Agnes said, her voice small and fierce at the door, "tell it like it is. Not more, not less. The court needs the truth, not the theater. Clara climbed into the saddle with Netty strapped close. Emmett rode nearby, his horse's rhythm a metronome for the way courage can be ordinary. Silas watched them go from the gate, as if committing the line of his life to memory. Sheriff Baker had arranged for a deputy to escort them. Not because he believed the danger would be in their path. Danger in that particular lane was more likely to be social than physical, but because the law prefers forms. A man with papers behind him feels larger, even if what he carries is false. They moved out in a line that was not triumphant. It was functional and honest. The county seat lay several miles away, and the road rose and fell like an old rhythm. The air was sharp enough to let a person think clearly. Clara kept Netty tied against her chest and watched the world pass in thin slices. A fence, a frozen ditch, a stand of gray trees. Each thing mattered only as far as it showed who she was. A woman who had tilled ground, who could read the look of a soil, who had sewn and stitched, who could endure cold and was now willing to endure the public exposure that law required. As they crossed a low hill, the sun made a small, fearful thing of the snow. Clara found herself thinking not of the moment she would give testimony in court, but of the night she had chosen to flee. In memory, it did not play false or sensational. It was a pragmatic account of a woman who had done only what necessary. But as a narrative in a courthouse, it would have to survive cross-examination, and the way men like Virgil would try to rearrange the furniture of a story. Clara prayed in the manner a farmer knows, quiet, specific invocations to practical ends. She prayed for the judge to be a man of sense, for the sheriff to do his duty, and for witnesses to speak plainly. But mostly she prayed to the stubbornness inside herself that had refused to rum a second time. If God had any particular ear for such prayers, he might have listened to the simple wish that a small child be allowed to be kept. They reached the county seat at noon. The courthouse was a modest building, whitewashed, with a bell that chimed once when they came up the steps. A clerk took the packet, and then a deputy led them to a small anteroom where the light was flat and the air smelled faintly of ink. The room was as unromantic as law can be, a place where details are sorted and the human heart waits for judgment. Clara sat with Netty in her arms and watched the door. In that waiting room, the town collected itself. Faces appeared in no particular predictability. A man or two who had sided with Virgil, a woman who had come to show solidarity, a neighbor who had come because curiosity is a kind of currency. Agnes stood near the door, a fixed presence, and her ledger of notations looked like a small armor. When the judge finally called the matter, Clara felt the surge that only the opening of an ordeal can make. The awareness that all the small stitches of preparation will now be tested by the blunt instrument of process. She was ready, she told herself, ready as one can be when the next step is a matter of law and not mere survival. The hearing would be the place where they would ask the question that mattered. Who could best guarantee Netty's safety in the days to come? Clara intended to show them not spectacle, but proof. Witnesses who saw the bruises, a midwife who could attest to past injuries, neighbors who knew when fights had broken out. She would not pretend innocence where remorse did not sit. She would lay out the facts and let the law do what it could. And beneath the court's procedure, a quieter war would be waged. Virgil's charm against Clara's quiet fortitude. The town's appetite for a simple story against the complexity of a life lived with contradiction. But on that day, as Clara stood at the courthouse steps with the winter wind making small armies of her skirts, she felt steadier than any part of her had a right to be. She had chosen to stand. She would not be simply another shadow that the town would forget. She would hold her child and face the town and, if it came to that, the law. The courthouse bell had a way of throwing sound like a stone dropped into a pond. The echo reached Clara before the door opened. Inside, the room smelled of old wood and coal smoke, of papers handled 1,000 times. Men in everyday coats cleared their throats. A few women turned their faces to watch. Faces meant things here: pensions, grudges, long borrowings of sugar and favors. Clara felt each face like a finger on a fence, measuring, testing, trying to find a loose board. They were called in small groups. When her turn came, Clara stood with Netty pressed to her chest, a small, warm weight beneath the heavy fabric of her patched coat. The judge's bench was plain and higher than she expected. Judge Wheeler sat behind it with a pair of spectacles low on his nose, and a look that had been worn by many winters and more decisions than either of them might know. He did not look like a man who would be impressed by polished boots, but he would listen to a clear set of facts. That steadiness was, for Clara, as important as anything. Virgil Harkins arrived with the kind of entourage wealth buys: a lawyer whose collar was iron-starched and a look of patient calculation that made his smile more of a business plan than charm. He moved through the courtroom as if it were a parlor, in which his merits could be displayed. He cast a glance at Clara, one patient, insinuating, and she felt the old reaction in her skin like a flare of cold. Yet, when his lawyer stood and began to speak in the soft and careful cadences that lawyers use to make truth sound like furniture, Clara felt the strange steadiness that had taken root in her during the long nights at the Brennan house. She had not come to the courthouse to perform. She had come to make the truth explicit and small in its elements: dates, witnesses, a letter here, a notated injury there. They were not theatrical things, but they were better armor than any cloak. The first witness to be called was Agnes Whitmore. She shuffled forward with a ledger tucked under her arm and the look of a woman whose practice had been to remember. Agnes's voice was not loud, but it had the particular clarity of someone who kept accounts for more than just money. She read, from the ledger, notes of visits, of nights when Clara's door had been shut behind a man stumbling, of times when a child's cry had been heard, and when a neighbor had seen a mark. The notes were small, anonymous, details that could be dismissed singly, but that began to look like a pattern when knit together. On the night of November 9th, Agnes read slowly, Mrs. Winslow came to my door. She had a bruised lip and asked if my granddaughter might watch the child while she sought help. She returned in the morning with her coat torn. Agnes looked at Virgil as if to ask whether he wished to deny the ledger entry with truth or with performance. Virgil frowned, as if offended by the ledger's existence at all. His lawyer rose, all mildness, and suggested that memories can be faulty. The suggestion was a map of a common strategy: make the truth look like fog. Then came the midwife, Martha Lyle, a woman with hands like rolled cloth and eyes that had seen many small lives delivered into the world. She spoke plainly of the time she had been called to the Winslow house, and of how she had seen bruising and the trace of a woman broken in ways that did not glory in drama, but did not pretend things had not happened. She did not paint pictures. She said, with the directness of someone whose profession is measuring, that the wounds she had once seen were consistent with severe force. Virgil's lawyer pushed then, politely but with a practiced antagonism, trying to frame what Martha had seen as a misunderstanding. Is it not possible, he asked, that these marks could have been caused by any number of accidents? A fall? A door? Martha's hands tightened, as if on the plane at a birth. The body remembers, she said finally, not theatrically, but as if stating the obvious. It tells you a shape that accidents do not. Silas Brennan took the stand like a man who knew how to be necessary. He spoke of the night Clara came, of the way she arrived at his gate with a child in her arms, of how a man who knew weather could not abide leaving another to it. He did not call Virgil a bad man in the dramatic sense. He spoke of a pattern he had seen in the valley, a man who raised his voice until people listened, and who, when he found no listener, turned to other measures. His statement was like a plank of fence, simple, useful, and hard to overturn. Emmett, who had the sort of childhood directness adults are always astonished by, was asked to say whether he'd seen Clara at any time after she'd come to the Brennan place. He spoke of the wooden heart he had given Netty and how the child had taken comfort from small, steadfast things. The prosecutor, an ally from the county seat who had known Agnes from long ago, used Emmett's plain recollection to show the court that Clara was not some transient figure, but a mother attached to a child in the purposeful way that only people who have to survive, morning after morning, do. Clara was not called to speak until later. In court, the order of things is a kind of choreography. The law wants to see how witnesses behave before it faces the primary voice. She had rehearsed not words, she did not believe rehearsals could save her, but the posture of her testimony, measured, precise, spare. She did not wish to give men ammunition by excess of narrative. When she rose, the room hushed in a way that made her feel the length of air between people. She looked at the judge and then at the gallery, where faces watched like a harvest of small interests. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. She told the story plainly, exactly as one might list the rows of a field. She said when she had first left, the date she had gone to Agnes, the night she had spent walking without sleep. She did not describe the acts in lurid detail. When she rose, the room hushed in a way that made her feel the length of air between people. She looked at the judge and then at the gallery, where faces watched like a harvest of small interests. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. She told the story plainly, exactly as one might list the rows of a field. She said when she had first left, the date she had gone to Agnes, the night she had spent walking without sleep. She did not describe the acts in lurid detail. She described consequences, sleeplessness, injuries that had been dressed by a midwife, the times she had been prevented from leaving to market, the ways promises had been used to shudder her into silence. She read, finally, the letter she had kept, a letter in which Virgil had offered apologies that smelled of calculation, a small paper that had once acted as balm before the next injury. The letter, in the courtroom, looked like decisive evidence. A man had written the words his lawyer would now try to explain away. "Did you ever ask for help?" the judge asked, his voice low and not unkind. "Yes," Clara said. "I tried doors. They closed." "And why did you come here?" the judge asked. "Because the child mattered more than the running," she said. "Because leaving without proof leaves a woman as only rumor, and a man with money can file the rest." Her voice did not quaver. "I'm a farmer. I've worked plots that took 2 seasons to show profit. I know how to keep something small and precious alive." What she had said was not rhetorical flourish. It was a ledger line. The judge made a slight note, the kind of bureaucratic punctuation that turns testimony into action. Virgil's lawyer rose and did what lawyers do. He asked leading questions designed to convert dates into doubt. He tried to paint Clara's flight as impulsive, as a woman of unstable will who had chosen theatrics over the ordinary administration of marriage. It was a move meant to appeal to the deep presumption the law often carries, that the man's claim to a child's custody carries comfortable weight. The lawyer's questions sought to make Clara look small and erratic, as if scale was the same as truth. But the pattern the witnesses had made was sturdy. They had not relied on dramatic flourish, but on accumulated small facts. A ledger here, a midwife's notation there, Silas's testimony of the way someone arrives at a farmhouse in the night. Each piece was not persuasive alone, but together they formed a fence that Virgil's lawyer could not easily leap. There was a moment, small and final, that shifted the room. The lawyer asked if Clara had ever spoken ill of Virgil in the past, searching for a motive. Clara answered simply. She had loved when the house was good, and she had feared when it was not. She said she had not wanted the life to fall into spectacle. She had wanted safety. The simplicity of the answer made spectacle unnecessary. When the judge announced he would issue an injunction to prevent Virgil from removing Netty from the county pending a full hearing, the room released its held breath like a field after rain. The injunction was not a final answer, but it was a door shut against sudden action. It was the law's way of saying, for the moment, hold. It gave Clara time. time to gather further evidence, time to prevent a man of wealth from making a move on a child. Outside the courtroom, the air hit Clara sharp as a plow edge. People gathered in small clusters. Some nodded, some averted their faces. The news traveled faster than any legal paper could. In the general store, men argued about what a public man really owed the town. Women moved in hushed bands to offer bread. Agnes hugged Clara with the kind of embrace that set bones to rights by pressure more than sentiment. Virgil left the courthouse with a face like a man whose plan had been interrupted. He seemed surprised, not by the injunction, he had predicted risks, but by the depth of witnesses that had lined up. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he made his response by way of papers, a set of affidavits that attempted to paint Clara as a woman who had had past instances of instability, a polite motion suggesting that the injunction was premature. His attack was not a fight in the street, it was the law's honest counterpart in ink. But legal processes have a tendency to split a community into small constellations. People begin to align. They calculate risk and reputation. Sheriff Baker, who had been steady in the back of the dilemma, acted with the careful reserve of a man who knows the line between duty and favor. He informed Virgil that the injunction had been filed and that any attempt to remove Netty would be met with arrest for interference with court orders. That statement was plain law, and law measured men by their willingness to abide by it. For Virgil, the courtroom loss was a crack in a facade that had stood on the village for years. He began to move differently in town. His smile was more brittle, his voice less sure. People who had once sought his company engineered polite distance. He found, for the first time, that his ledger of favors was not unlimited. For Clara, the injunction was relief but not triumph. The law had offered a pause. It had not rewired the social ledger that had for so long counted in a man's favor. Over the coming weeks, the farm at the Brennan place became both refuge and command center. Letters were sent to the county seat, witnesses were tracked down. The midwife's notes were transcribed and certified by a local doctor who had seen Clara upon arrival and had recorded his observations in a small, neat hand. Evidence gathered in the small way of frontier work, not with the resources of a city, but with the sort of people who remembered other people's lives like a map. The process brought new costs. A few storekeepers closed their doors for a day. Some neighbors became distant. Virgil tried to weaponize public opinion. He suggested that Clara had tried to force a quarrel to win public sympathy. He wrote to the town paper a polite letter about family rights and restoring children to their home. Words were his instrument. They always had been. Then, in a scene of ordinary courage, a woman named Lillian Markham, who had once been too frightened to speak aloud about her own beating, came forward to tell what she had seen. Lillian's voice had been silenced for years, but the sight of Netty at the Brennan hearth had moved her to action. She spoke of a time when Virgil's temper had turned on her, and of how she had been too young and scared to do anything. Her testimony carried a particular weight because it made the pattern seem not isolated, but habitual. When the case moved closer to a full hearing, there was an underlying change of temperature in the town. People who had counted Virgil as unassailable began to learn how much a man's public face could be a stage mask. Those who had believed his excuses found the ledger that Agnes kept difficult to ignore. On the morning the full hearing was scheduled, Clara stood in front of the courthouse steps again. This time she felt different, less like a person bearing a secret, and more like someone who had chosen a line of work that required public reckoning. She was wearing the same patched coat, but it sat on her with a different sort of dignity. Her voice, when she spoke to the judge, was still plain, the cadence of someone who measures a sentence as a farmer measures a row. "Your Honor," she said, "I ask not for a prize, but for a child's safety." Judge Wheeler listened with that benediction of attention that is rare. He had read the affidavits, he had seen the midwife's notations and the doctor's scrawl. He had heard the ledger of witnesses. The law, like the soil, is reluctant to make absolute judgments on small evidence. It prefers a steady accumulation. Still, he had power to weigh, and he did weight the world carefully. During the hearing, Virgil's lawyer tried to weave a different narrative, a woman who had been influenced by men of the farm, who had decided to make a scene. He suggested that Clara might use the child as currency. The suggestion was bald and ugly. Yet in court, ugly things are sometimes given a genteel wrapping by rhetoric. Clara's testimony that day was the kind of courage that is not loud. She began at the beginning, how she had met Virgil, the slow unpeeling of promises, the day the apology letter had been written and later invalidated by other actions. She did not dramatize. She told dates and places. When asked to describe the injuries, she spoke of the help she had had, the midwife's presence, and the doctor's notation. She let other witnesses do the moral verdicting. Her job was to make the facts stand clear. The turning point came when the county prosecutor, who, upon reading the depositions, had found reason to interest himself, stood and asked the court to consider both the civil matter of custody and the criminal implications of the witnesses' testimonies. He was a broad-shouldered man who had been once on the sheriff's side of a long winter patrol. "The matter before the court," he said soberly, "presents sufficient evidence for me to open an inquiry into possible charges. The state has an interest in ensuring the safety of minors and in investigating alleged assaults." It was a moment when law caught up with social conscience. The prosecutor's decision to investigate was not a verdict. It was the gears turning toward accountability. For Virgil, whose life had been measured by transactions and reputations, the prosecutor's interest was a new and bitter thing. In the days that followed, the prosecutor's office did what it must. Interviews were held, statements were formalized, and an evidence chain was created. The sheriff's deputies, who had until now played a cautious role, began to take complaints more seriously. Virgil protested in letters and in speech, calling the investigation an overreach and painting himself as a wronged man. But so many witnesses had lined up, the midwife, Agnes, Martha, Lillian, that it became harder to paint Clara as the manipulative party. The prosecutor's cautiousness was not negligence. It was law doing its slow, careful work. When the judge finally issued a more permanent order, awarding temporary custody to Clara and issuing a protective order that kept Virgil at a distance, the sound throughout Cedar Falls was not of triumph, but of a careful recognition. The temporary custody was given on the basis of best interest, of what the child needed now. It did not extinguish the possibility that a man could seek to persuade the court in another forum, but it did grant Clara the legal right to feed, to care, to decide with the authority of the law behind her. For the first time in months, Clara felt the peculiar unloosening of a weight. The sheriff's protective order meant that Virgil could not come near the farmhouse. If he did, he would face arrest. Words can be a weapon. The law can be a shield. Combined, they allowed a woman to rebuild a life. After the hearing, there was no roaring celebration. There were small acts of care. Agnes brought a kettle boiled until it sang. Silas repaired a broken latch on the farmhouse gate. Emmett carved another wooden heart and tucked it into Netty's blanket. The work of living is often more precise and ordinary than spectacle. It is in fixing a hinge, in turning soil, in letting a child run down a lane. People who had come to watch in the courthouse returned to their daily jobs, their faces altered by what they had seen. Some softened, some hardened. The town, like soil, had been tilled. And Clara? She did not go away afterward to sleep the sleep of someone who had been saved. She began to lay the foundations of a different life. The farmhouse, that rough perimeter of wood and smoke, had been a temporary shelter. Now it would become, by intention, a place where other women might find the same kind of help. Prosperity had always been measured in store ledgers. Clara's new accounting would be measured in shelter beds, in the number of women who could arrive tired but not alone, in the sound of children's play across the yard. She began slowly, the way one plants a stubborn row. First, she spoke with Agnes about the records, what to file, how to keep dates and witness lists in a way that could matter when a woman came in after a night away. Agnes, with her ledger memory, became the network's beating heart. She knew who had a spare room, who would give a ride, which midwife could be trusted. Silas contributed his barn and a pair of hands for repairs. Emmett became the steady runner who could fetch supplies and deliver messages between households. Sheriff Baker, who had watched and listened, offered to provide official support when safety measures were required. Word traveled quietly at first. Women came with the kinds of quiet needs that are hard to advertise: a place to stay while they gathered themselves, a promise that a court would listen to them if they chose, a bowl of soup and a warm cot. The Brennan farm welcomed them one by one: a woman with a child and a suitcase of clothes, a girl who had finally gathered the courage to leave, an older woman whose marriage had frayed into 1,000 small humiliations. The house did not become an overnight spectacle, it became a station, a slow and intentional harbor. There were practical problems: space, food, money. Clara and Silas worked with farmers in neighboring valleys to rotate milk and grain deliveries in exchange for shelter days. Agnes taught other women to keep records. The town's older women, whose reputations were sometimes the only safe currency left to those who had none, offered their skills: mending, speaking as witnesses, testifying about the way a man had behaved. Over months, the shelter, what people began to call, in hushed and respectful tones, the harbor, grew into a small, sustainable thing. Not everyone approved. There were men in the town who muttered that the farm was meddling in family matters. Virgil himself tried to keep pressure on by writing op-eds, threatening civil suits, and making polite calls that had the scent of menace. His public face remained clean, and for a while his resentment was a low, humming presence. The prosecutor's investigation continued at a deliberate pace. Even as the harbor welcomed women, legal processes required patience. The harbor's first triumph came in the shape of a woman named Sarah Haynes, who had previously been tethered by fear to a life of small humiliations. When she arrived at the farm, she brought a child and the particular exhausted humility of someone who had learned to make herself smaller than she was. Clara and Agnes did not perform heroics. They offered beds, a warm stew, and recorded Sarah's testimony. Sarah later gave a statement that helped the prosecutor marshal new charges, small pieces of law welded together until they formed the shape of accountability. When the county prosecutor finally filed charges for assault and coercion against Virgil Harkins, the town heard it not in fanfare, but as a slow recognition that law could follow public testimony. Virgil contested the charges fiercely. The courts moved as they always do, slow and certain. The arrest, when it came, was sober. Sheriff Baker and 2 deputies took Virgil into custody by daylight. The newspaper men of the county wrote about it in tones that blended incredulity with the hunger for headlines. Virgil protested his innocence to the end. He insisted the charges were political, that the law had been misused. But the record had been made: witnesses, notes, the midwife's careful lines. For Clara, the arrest was not a triumph to dance upon. It was an act of public redress, one that meant a man who had once seemed untouchable now faced consequences. She did not gloat. She visited the courthouse when papers required her presence, and she returned to the harbor and to the slow work of building shelter beds. Children started to run across the yard, and the sound of Netty's laughter, once scarce, began to seep into the fabric of the farmhouse. Emmett, who had been a boy that first night, now held Netty's hand and taught her how to swing a rope in the yard. Silas fixed a gate and hummed as he worked. The harbor grew in quiet ways. Women who had found refuge taught each other canning and how to account for receipts. Some found work washing for the nearby feed store. Others learned to tend goats for milk. Agnes's ledger became a small manual of best practices for keeping testimony and for preserving the tiny things that make a life credible in court: dates, receipts, the small recordings of who was present. It was ugly work, but necessary. The harbor made itself into a network, and networks have a way of repaying courage with practical help. There were nights Clara sat alone on the stoop and watched the cedar wind move the fence posts and thought about the price of standing. There were evenings when the memory of slamming doors made her stomach barrel. But the panorama of the farm, of children playing in the dirt, of women learning how to stitch a seam that would hold under pressure, felt like the slow recompense of those nights. She had stood, and because she had stood, other people had found it easier to stop running. The town of Cedar Falls changed in small increments. People spoke differently about family and rights. Men who had once laughed off a woman's complaint found themselves more cautious. The general storekeeper, who had once stepped aside to avoid being caught in a social tangle, now took more calls from his neighbors in the warmth of human business. Agnes's ledgers became a public resource, a way for women to document things that previously had been private and therefore invisible. It was ugly work, but necessary. The harbor made itself into a network, and networks have a way of repaying courage with practical help. There were nights Clara sat alone on the stoop and watched the cedar wind move the fence posts and thought about the price of standing. There were evenings when the memory of slamming doors made her stomach barrel. But the panorama of the farm, of children playing in the dirt, of women learning how to stitch a seam that would hold under pressure, felt like the slow recompense of those nights. She had stood, and because she had stood, other people had found it easier to stop running. The town of Cedar Falls changed in small increments. People spoke differently about family and rights. Men who had once laughed off a woman's complaint found themselves more cautious. The general storekeeper, who had once stepped aside to avoid being caught in a social tangle, now took more calls from his neighbors in the warmth of human business. Agnes's ledgers became a public resource, a way for women to document things that previously had been private and therefore invisible. Clara did not take on a role of public spokesperson. She remained a farmer who rose at dawn and knew the exact feel of soil in her hands. She taught women how to feed geese and mend harnesses. She showed them how to turn a small profit from eggs and how to keep a child warm in the wind. Her agency was in action, not in rhetoric. She worked the land as a way of keeping both her head and her hands steady. Her decision to stand in the courthouse had been a legal confrontation. The building of the harbor was a life assertion. Months later, the criminal trial began. Courtroom procedure moved with the slowness of flocks migrating. Evidence had to be laid out, witnesses called, the prosecutor prepared. Virgil's defense attempted to discredit witnesses, to paint motives as malice. But the living testimony persisted. A ledger kept by Agnes, the midwife's notes, Sarah Haynes' account, Martha Lyle's care, the doctor's observations. The pattern was consistent, and the law, though not infallible, found in that consistent pattern sufficient cause to convict on select charges. The verdict did not transform memory into consummate justice. It made an official acknowledgement that harm had occurred and that accountability had a place in the machinery of the county. The legal consequences were not the end of pain. There were fines and restrictions and a sentence, and Virgil's reputation shrank like something left to rot. But for Clara, the sentence mattered less than the way it allowed other women to speak without being mocked into silence. It signaled to those who had been hidden that the town could be called to account. The harbor continued to grow. It became a place where, on certain afternoons, a woman might find a legal aid volunteer waiting to help with forms, where a man like Sheriff Baker might come to give small workshops on the protections the law offered, where Agnes taught other ledger keepers how to record a life. They did not do it as a charity, they did it as a practical economy of survival. Summer came, and with it a garden that Clara had planted as if in defiance of every winter she had known. The rows were neat, and the beans climbed the corn poles. Children chased one another between the beds, Netty among them, her laugh breaking open in a way that used to be rare. Clara watched from the porch, a hand on a rail worn by generations, feeling the durable peace that arrives when small labors have meaning. The farm had become a community in miniature, a place where people could be mended slowly. Sometimes, at dusk, Clara would walk the length of her field and think of the decision she had made the night she fell to her knees in the snow. She replayed, not as pain, but as testament, the moment she had offered Netty to a stranger and asked for mercy. She thought of Silas's hand on the latch, of Emmett's carved heart, of Agnes's ledger. She thought of the judge who had listened and the prosecutor who had had enough courage to move. She knew that it had been a chain of small acts as much as any single legal pronouncement that had changed the course of things. The town was not perfectly transformed. Gossip still had teeth. Some men still relied on old assumptions. But people who once would have remained silent now spoke softly and with more confidence. A woman at the feed store might now, with the protection of a neighbor's presence, mention to another that, if you need a place, there is a porch at the Brennan farm. That small sentence has the capacity to alter a life. One autumn, when the first frost bent the field into lace, there was a small ceremony at the harbor. Not a wedding in the public sense, those are the things of show, but a gathering of the many hands that had turned the place from shelter to sanctuary. Women sat on benches and spoke in quiet voices about how they had learned to keep records, how they had learned to trust a neighbor. Children ran about like birds, faces bright and unscarred by the sort of fear that had once been common. Clara stood up to speak for a moment, not in the courthouse, but among the people who had chosen to make something that waited for no applause. She did not say she had been brave. She said instead, with the plain truth that had carried her through, that standing had been the only thing that made the rest possible. If you have nothing else, she said, looking at the faces she had come to know, keep the dates, keep the names, keep your courage in small things. Milk a goat, mend a seam. If the law will listen, give it facts. If the world will not listen, find a porch that will. There was an odd and gentle humor in the way people clapped, not for a hero, but for a neighbor. Agnes handed Clara a jar of preserves. Emmett thrust another wooden heart into Netty's hand. Silas, who had never been given to public speech, clapped with the solid hand of a man who had helped make a thing hold. Years later, the harbor stood as a modest testament, a line of beds, a ledger cabinet, a garden that knew dirt and patience below its loamy face. The town of Cedar Falls had shifted in its small gravitational pulls. The men who had sought to make money the only currency of credibility found that credibility had other denominations. Women had gathered a small, practical economy of safety. Clara still rose at dawn and walked the rows. The land remained faithful in its indifference. She planted, she fed, she cut wood, and she put Netty to bed. The child grew in the stead of things grown, slowly, stubbornly, like a favored row. Sometimes visitors came to the porch and asked how one woman had managed to stand against an entire town. Clara would laugh then, a quick sound like a stone dropping into a trough. I didn't stand alone, she'd say. I stood with the people who would do the small things. But I did the standing that day because there was no other way to keep my child. In the end, the story hardened into a truth that required no embellishment. On a single winter night, a farmer had faced the gale and the town and held her daughter out of harm by the only means at hand, by law, by witness, by stubborn, ordinary courage. The town learned that a woman's decision to stand could alter not only the fate of a child, but the moral geography of a place. On a porch in the center of that transformation, as cedar wind moved the fence posts and the sound of children faded into the evening, Clara watched Netty chase a red ribbon. The field smelled of turned soil and late apples. Steam rose from a pot in the kitchen. She thought of how many doors had shut before one had opened, and of the strange alchemy of one small person deciding not to run. The choice she had made was straightforward. She had stood in the light when the world had expected her to hide. That day at the courthouse, when she faced the town and told the truth, changed the town. It did not erase the wrongs done, and it did not pretend that justice was a single strike. But it did give the child a small, ordinary thing that matters more than any rhetoric, a future. If this account moved you and you want to hear more stories of ordinary courage on the frontier, of people who build shelter out of scraps and who use law and labor to protect the small and the vulnerable, follow the channel and share this story with someone who needs to know they're not alone.